It's now my pleasure to bring up our authors. Adam Johnson won the Pulitzer Prize for his novel Orphan Master's Son and the National Book Award for his story collection Fortune Smiles. He's here to celebrate the launch of his novel, The Wayfinder, along with the celebrated author Amitav Ghosh. Please welcome them both to the stage.
I finally get to see. Oh, here's all the people. Here's this beautiful room.
Well, isn't it wonderful to be here?
It is my first time here. This is the most beautiful facility I can imagine.
It's great, actually. It's really great for young writers. They can come spend the day here. But let me say straight away, what a privilege it is to be here with Adam. This is an absolutely wonderful book. It completely transported me to a world that I've always been curious about, but always very ignorant of, which is the Pacific Islands. You know, it really just is one of those historical novels which just takes you outside yourself, outside your time, to a completely different place. Incredibly winning characters, incredibly interesting stories, and wonderful how the stories intersect with each other. Now, Adam, you have a piece that you'd like to read from the way.
Okay, yeah, sure. One page. One page. I know it's scary to have a writer read because they might be really boring. But if it's just a page, then you haven't lost much. Thanks to everyone who came out tonight. Again, I've never been in such a wonderful, I don't know, I wanted to say facility, but I don't know, space before. And why did I grab my phone? Amitav is, that book of your Sea of Poppies, I just couldn't.
Oh, thank you.
I just can't believe what a masterpiece that is. And
thank you.
Thank you. I would love to turn the tables on you and ask you about every aspect of that book. Maybe I will.
No, this is your night, and we are very lucky to be here.
And
it's pub date for you.
Yeah, it is, yeah.
Yeah, so that's a very special privilege.
Okay, I was just going to read one page. It's from the middle of the book, so it won't make intellectual sense. So don't try. Don't think about, hey, what's going on? What is happening here? Just maybe try to see it. Two canoes are going across the Pacific, and they've got a long ways to go, and one of them isn't doing so great. Dawn on the open sea. Aprons of rain over silent water, scent of far-off lightning. The wind was picking up. The outrigger, used to plunging through the swells, now skimmed its surface, lifting so that only a trail of spittle touched the sea. This was the morning we finished Fanau's tattoo. Did I mention Fanau was naked during these inking sessions? My mother positioned a scrap of tapa cloth to preserve the young man's modesty, but his ure was prone to flop with the motion of the deck, and his hairy raho kept swinging into view. Nearing completion, the waves my mother inked grew frothy with the chaos of shore break. A ring of driftwood around Fanau's leg completed the pattern. Here, the sea and the shore made their peace. My mother never inked beyond the human face. She'd never departed from known motifs. She'd never spent so long on a single tattoo. Fanau, when we sought his final approval, was asleep. These inking sessions had become a welcome distraction from the behavior of our vaca, whose lashings were crackling with the strain. At some point, the hull had begun to flex. Each time the bow lifted, the center of the waka yawned so that light shone through the joints and the once snug thwarts. And when the bow fronted a stiff wave, instead of making a satisfying thump, the vaca seemed to go, oof. The Wayfinder had taken to sailing astride us, close enough that a calabash of water with a proper throw could be tossed between decks. His own vodka rode perilously low, and his figure was visible through sprays of baled water. He'd call for my father to touch a certain stay line and report how taut it was. He shouted for my father to put his ear to the mast and report what he heard. Was the bow pulling one way or the other? Were vibrations felt through the steering oar? My mother called to the Wayfinder, "Are we past halfway?" The Wayfinder didn't respond. He knew the meaning of the question. We were wondering whether it was too late to turn back. In the stern, I marked the vastness of the sea. Purposeless, without feature, the roaming waters were punctuated by nothing but petrels and frigate birds and the rolling hillocks of the deep. How was it that we'd left our beautiful island, so steady, so solid? How rare an island now seemed. How impossible to ever find again. I'll just pause there.
I'm so glad you chose to read that particular passage because it's really memorable. Mm-hmm. I mean, I remembered it very vividly from the book. Well, one of the things that I really loved about the book is all the non-human characters that you have, you know. So especially dogs and parrots are a very important part of the book. But the only animal that gets to actually talk is a parrot. Mm-hmm. And why was that? Why only the parrot? Why not? For example, I mean, it's known that, you know, in Polynesian communities, there are these connections with, let's say, dolphins.
Right.
But you chose not to, you chose a parrot over a dolphin.
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. Why did I? Well, I will say that, you know, I did not set out to write a vast Polynesian epic. It's where my curiosity, where mysteries, where uncertainties, and my own issues led me. And they led me to the Tongan Empire and to the Moriori people. And the Moriori were of the Maori people of Aotearoa or New Zealand. How many people have been to New Zealand? And to Tonga? Okay. So in studying their mythologies, these were sacred stories that had come through the oral tradition. They'd survived for countless generations. And I had to take them seriously. They obviously, even very strange stories. There was a story of a man who had, in Tongan culture, who had a jellyfish tattooed on his hand. And he was famous for assaulting women and brandishing a tattoo onto, he could transfer the tattoo from his hand to their bodies. And I'm not completely sure what that story meant, but it was preserved through oral storytelling for thousands of years. And so it had a role. And in the Maori lore, the parrots didn't talk. So one character was Maori, her parrot is a normal parrot. But the Tongans in their mythology, like there were parrots who could recite poetry. And I had to take that as very seriously. This was, you know, sacred enough to be preserved. And so I had to be true to that. And so I kind of looked to oral history.
Yeah, that was a question I was going to ask you, actually. I mean, you've obviously done an enormous amount of research. So this war between the Tongans and the Fijians, I assume there are sources for that? Mm-hmm. So what sorts of archival sources did you have, considering that these are non-literate, I mean, you know, cultures without writing, so to speak?
Well, I'm going to answer that question. One thing I think I made several discoveries just as a storyteller and as a writer. One is like the power of oral history. And, you know, I met a storyteller in Auckland, and, you know, she was one of the most amazing storytellers I ever met. And afterwards I talked to her, and she kind of mentioned casually the canoe that had brought her people to Aotearoa from Tahiti, like 1,000 years ago. She knew the name of the canoe, the Te Arawa, which means the shark. She named all 26 people who were in that foundational boat, including the captain, and who her ancestor was. And that meant that like this story mattered enough that it was never not told once through the generations, ever. And so they have the tradition of whakapapa, of reciting the genealogies, which a lot of cultures have, and which is not, we don't do that on a Saturday night here. And so like I don't know, if we went back 1,000 years into Europe, like how much would we trust the stories, right? Oral storytelling was also a little flexible too. I feel like it was a little limber. I wish our Constitution was a little limber. Honestly, it seems impossible to update it for our times. But what if we had an oral Constitution? So part of the answer to that is that the Tongans were never colonized. And it was only really Micronesia and Tonga that were never colonized. And I do believe it was just because Micronesia was so spread out, like 10,000 islands add up to the mass of Delaware. And that Tonga, like they just didn't have a deep port. They didn't have anything for an imperial power to think was worthy of the expenditure probably. But so Tonga had retained its culture in many ways. And it's still the kingdom of Tonga. Like people from Tonga say, hey, I'm from the kingdom, right? But they were missionized. And I saw this time and time again, that the people who went to spread the gospel were often absolutely fascinated with the cultures they were destroying. And there were a couple early pastors, of the Wesleyan Church, who, even as they were saying, tattooing is pagan, we must stop it, right? You're gonna have to put on cloth clothing. Oh, you're not doing that dance again, trust me. I've got a new story for you to tell. It's a story, there were a couple people who just, like one of them was named Caldecott, and he wrote 9 epic books about the Tonga he was erasing. One of them was called The Place Names of Tonga. It's like 700 pages.
Wow.
And he walked around Tonga, just like we have street signs. He would say, what's the name of that path? What's the name of that tree? Like, what's the name of this beach? And how did it get its name? That was so valuable to me. So there's this troubling thing that the earliest witnesses and reporters were the ones who were actively undermining everything that they were saving, right?
Very, very common colonial story.
Very common.
Yeah. So
I didn't answer the question, did I?
Yes.
Was it about Tonga?
No, it was
Fiji?
about archives.
Okay, yeah. Oh, that one book that I just mentioned, the place names of Tonga. I mentioned this in the back room. When I checked it out, it had last been checked out in 1956. So I was like, this stuff isn't in big demand. I found a niche, right?
So you also have Native American heritage, and this attachment to place is very much a part of Native American tradition, right?
I think so, yeah. In my family, I have 3 European grandparents and then a missing person. So my grandmother Lavina was born on the reservation. She died on the reservation. She left the reservation. She had 9 brothers who were all sent to residential schools, if you know what those are, and she and her sister were sent to missionary schools that on the reservation, and were taught sewing by nuns, taught sewing and nursing, and she did become a nurse. What her life was like, I would give anything to have one story of her. And she had my mother, and moved on to have another family. She had 4 families, but left all those kids and returned alone to the reservation, and 5 marriages. And so I've talked to a couple of her siblings. They say she was a black sheep, but they don't really want to talk about her. But it seems like there's trauma there. But so, missing stories always offended me. There was always something not there at the table, and I always wondered. And so, when I talk about what that inheritance is, it's a disruption. That's what I feel.
I don't know if you know this young writer and filmmaker called Julian Brave Noisecat.
Tell me.
He's made a wonderful film about his own family's history of these schools, the boarding schools and so on, just to mention that. But do you think that heritage is what draws you to these very out-of-the-way stories, as it were? I mean, did that have something to do with your writing this book?
Well, on my father's side of the family, you know, like my grandfather, you know, flew B-17s in World War II. He was this incredible storyteller. And his brother, great uncle Dick, was Patton's interpreter. And like they liberated Buchenwald. Every summer, I would be sent to South Dakota, where I was from, and just I would hear stories and stories and stories and stories. My great-grandmother lived to be 107. She was born in 1901, and she would talk about her first radio, seeing her first car, seeing her first airplane. She would talk about the Great War, about the Great Depression, you know. And then on my other side, like my grandmother Lavina, she married like a Norwegian Scottish farmer who never went more than 50 miles in his life from the place where he was born. And that was to go to a courthouse. And he was a reticent, critical man. And that half of the family bore nothing. It was mysteries to me. Wow. And I always felt mystery, that there was something. Oh, and their family graveyard, like, they were called the Three Coyotes. There were three men who were buried by themselves in the corner of the cemetery, away from everyone else. And my grandfather would say, I would be like, who are they? And he's like, oh, they're the damn coyotes. And I was like, why are they buried over there? He's like, you don't want to know. So, I don't know. I do believe the half-seen and the unseen thing is what stimulates the fiction writer's mind. And if you know something, well, you just move on to another mystery. But something gets the imagination going. You start filling in the unknown.
Absolutely. I think the unseen is such an important part of any kind of writer's imaginative life. But in this book, you have so many aspects of the unseen. I mean, like there's this magical fan which can do all kinds of things.
Yeah.
How did you think of that?
Don't you want a magical fan?
I do, yes.
In Tongan mythology, there's sometimes it's translated as the underworld. You know, these stories have moved from the oral history into books, and that transmission is mysterious to me. Who did it and how, and often it's in Victorian English. So, but there's either an island of the afterlife or a kind of underworld, which I think is a Victorian interpretation of that. The island of Pluto, where it's like maybe one of the supreme gods of the Tongan cosmogony is Hikuleo. Hikuleo is a really pretty cool god. He is both male and female, blind and all-seeing. And so he knows when you do something, but he also doesn't know, which feels really quantum to me, honestly, when we think about quantum information. And but in the island of the afterlife, he had a life-affecting fan. And he could fill something full of life. He could waft a flower and it would blossom, or waft a tree and it would fill with fruit. And he could draw a breath from you and you would just wither. And there's a famous story about a young woman, a Promethean story named Lalonga Vava'u, and she steals this fan from the afterlife. And in my book, one person has this fan. And it's way cooler than like a gun or like, this thing is cool.
Yep, it definitely is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it belongs to an older woman, and she often will a character dies, it's always sad, but she'll bring them back to life for a little bit and interrogate them and get just a little extra information, a little bonus, and then she'll just snuff them.
Yes. So
tenderly, I meant that tenderly.
Well, as you have seen in the bit that he read, there are a lot of unfamiliar words. Mm-hmm. So I imagine you did a lot of linguistic research, did you? Do you speak any of the languages?
Oh my gosh, what a great question. I know that from someone who speaks the languages. When I read your novel, Sea of Poppies, there is all of this local language, kind of almost Creole-ish language, Lascar language, Bengali, all mixed in. And it was only when at the end I realized there's a huge glossary at the back that explained what all these words meant. It was a total surprise to me. And I was like, but you know, something about the way you weaved the context, like I got it. And I learned some Lascar words. And I felt like if I went on one of those ships, I could, you know, say a few things. It's lost a little now, but while I was reading, I had that feeling. And I do believe, like, when you're putting language into the narrative, like, do you want to, let's say you're putting Korean into a book, do you want to write some Korean for your Korean readers that exclude non-Koreans, but as a, you know, as an Easter egg for them? Or do you want to translate? Or I definitely wanted, the Tongan language is fascinating to me, and I definitely wanted the reader to leave knowing a dozen words. And like one of the words that like took up root in our house is this word fe'unga, which means enough. And so at our dinner table, when all 5 of us are together, we can talk about anything, but we've all agreed that when someone says fe'unga, the topic is dead. Like there's no more asking about the girlfriend or how that date went or why you posted that on Instagram. Anyone can say this Tongan word. The answer is I do not speak Tongan. I have my Tongan dictionary that I sleep with under my pillow and my grammar. And I spent a lot of time writing Tongan poetry. And I think that was really good for my brain. Luckily, I know a Tongan writer, an academic named Vasalua Generhello, who dedicated years to help me. And you know, her father was a judge in Tonga, and when she was a girl, like, you don't all just go to the courthouse, like, the courthouse comes to you, because there's 161 islands in Tonga. And so her father would go from island to island to island settling disputes, the way the Tui Tonga once might. And so she got as a young person to see all of the islands of Tonga and get a sense of like how they operated. Wow. And so she had this deep, she's the only person I ever met who read all the books that I had read from the basement of the Stanford Library. And so we had like the richest discussions about this. And she helped translate all of the work, and she helped affirm a lot of the choices that I had made and helped educate me about many things. And it helped me with my confidence. Yeah.
She's at the University of Hawaii. I saw in your acknowledgments. Right?
She's she taught at Atanisi Institute in Tongatapu, and now she's at the University of the Pacific in Fiji.
Oh wow! Huh. So there must have been lots of wonderful travel for the book.
Well, I mean, I don't know about you. You've written 19 books. Like, the problem with being a writer is that you have to choose between living life and writing, you know, and many a day I would be in my basement and I would hear a fight taking place upstairs with my kids, or I would hear laughing. And I would be like, there are real people who need me. And I'm down here with my imaginary friends.
Yes.
Right? I like that dark trade that I made as a parent is something that haunts me. And so like I did, you know, travel to Tonga. I took my whole family there because they were like, what is this book you're writing? And I was like, you got to go see the place. You know, we went to 14 islands, you know. We went to Fiji and, of course, New Zealand, Aotearoa. But to go to the islands I really wanted to go to would mean like a month of not writing. It took me 10 years as it was.
Unbelievable, yeah.
How do you do it? You travel. How do you do it?
I don't know. It somehow works out. But, you know, to what you were saying earlier, after all, even if you're in your basement with your imaginary friends, you're in the same house as your kids,
yeah,
which you wouldn't have been if you were doing a 9-to-5, you know?
It's true. So, if I was at a real job, I couldn't run upstairs and yell at them.
That's
and
right.
then run back downstairs.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's the magic of a writer's life, if you ask me. But one of the themes which runs through the book and which I found incredibly interesting, especially considering our present circumstances, is that of collapse. Collapse and extinction. So is it really the case that within these Polynesian cultures, they would move to one island, exhaust it, and then move on?
All the islands are different. The islands come with a different suite of offerings to the human invaders, right? Visitors. We'll call them visitors. It's a nice use. And humans would bring a different suite with them, you know. And usually, when people would go exploring for an island, there is a cultural aspect there. You know, the second son, as a saying, the first son is born to rule the land, the second son is born to find new land. Like, what you do with the second son is a global historical conundrum. So part of that is just, they were explorers of the Pacific, I believe. But time and time again, this isn't me, this is my discovery of other people's expertise, is that, you know, people would find new islands. They would be really pristine and beautiful without mammals. They'd be filled with beaches full of fat turtles, ready for soup, fat iguanas dripping from the trees, and flightless birds. And that people would land, they would make, let's say, a 1,000-mile journey to find this island. We can talk about those journeys. They would find this island, it would offer its plenitude to them, their populations would boom, they would start cutting down trees and, you know, getting a terrestrial life rather than a seafaring life. In a couple years, couple generations, maybe they're not teaching the celestial navigation as sharply as they once did. Maybe they cut down too many trees. And suddenly, as the extinctions happen, on Tonga, which again, there are 160 islands, still they managed to make 24 species of birds extinct there. And on New Zealand, a big island, if you've been there, two big islands, they had 26 species go extinct. And so, like, New Zealand's huge. You can take a month-long driving trip through New Zealand easily. People landed there, their populations exploded. They went there because of conflict. They really weren't interested in going back. They expanded so much into their own territories that they started forming like iwi, which is their word for bone, like people of different bones of their tribes. Suddenly there were 20 tribes, 30 tribes, growing huge populations. When people would go to these islands, they would have, like, in their canoes, they'd be like, we're gonna take the pig, the chicken, and the dog. There was always one stowaway, which was that?
A rat.
The rat. To every island, the rat made it. They would take the paper mulberry, their sweet potato, their taro, right, their kava. They would take all the stuff they need. And in that months-long voyage, maybe the pigs didn't make it. Maybe the dogs didn't make it. Tonga didn't have the dog. That was a big issue. And they didn't have the pig. The Fijians had those big, juicy pigs, and there's a lot of oral history about trying to get that damn pig from the Fijians, but they won't give it to them. You know? And they went over on two big trips to say, please, please, please give us the pigs. And the Fijians said, okay, in the morning we'll give you the pigs. And then overnight, both times, they cooked 6 pigs. And they sent them home with cooked pigs, which drove the Tongans crazy. And when they came back the third time, they took the pig. Yeah.
So is that what the war was about?
Oh, what are wars about? That's a big question. But so let me just like New Zealand, when people landed there was a bird called a moa. What is that? A big flightless bird. They were about 250 kilos. They ran 400 to 600 pounds, 12 feet tall. There were probably 2 million of them extinct. There were 4 kinds of moa. The other 3 moas went extinct. What's 2 million times 500? That's a lot of calories. That's a lot of meat. And of course, these are humans. They didn't leave one, right? They didn't leave one. They went through all of the birds. Oh my God, there's a thing called a kakapo. Kaka is Proto-Polynesian for parrot, and po is Proto-Polynesian for night. It was a flightless, nocturnal parrot walking around in the dark, ready for the spit. They were big too, like turkeys. There are 243 left in the world just because they happen to live on an inconvenient island to go kill them. But, the Maori ended up making 4 species of snails extinct.
Wow.
When contact came, people were eating fern roots, and this, so like even in, and 1.5 million dogs, there was 1 left when a naturalist came in the 1880s. What did he do to it? Killed it, and then what did he do? He stuffed it. It's in the Te Papa Museum in Wellington. It's the worst piece of it's a universally acknowledged the worst piece of taxidermy ever. But 1.5 million dogs. Like that's how many people there were, and that's how much conflict there was. And when the resources run out, you can learn to live within your means. That is very difficult. You can fight amongst yourself over stuff. That's what they did in New Zealand because there were no close islands. Or you can do what Tonga did, and you can export your scarcity to other people and take their stuff. And so there was, when things didn't go good on the North Island, you would get kicked down to the South Island where life expectancy was low. And there was a group of people from the South Island, several groups, who escaped to the Kermadaks, to Norfolks, and to the Chatham Islands, Rikohu, which is where Carrero is. And on that island, I hope this is interesting, on that island, these people who had been starving, who had been enslaved by other people, who had escaped with their lives, decided to live differently. And there was an early chief of the Moriori named Nunuku, and he made Nunuku's law. And they decided to, number one, control their population. So every other male child was castrated at birth. Number two, they decided to decentralize power. They made chiefs of everything. You're the chief of fishing, you're the chief of farming, you're the chief of birding, right? And they ruled by consensus. They controlled their resources by making certain things, taboo, right? And they agreed to be a non-violent people. And they agreed to settle all conflict with a duel that ended with the first drop of blood. And so I have a people from this culture dealing with scarcity, and I have a people from the Tongan group who were like exporting their pain to other places. Fiji, Samoa, Nui, Rotuma, etc. And so there's a teenage girl in one world who's trying to figure out what the world is, and is this how it's supposed to be, and why do they have so little? And there's some teenage boys who are the son of the king in Tonga, and they're just starting to wake up to where their privilege comes from. And they come in collision in the book. That's the book. Sorry, it was a long digression.
No,
that's what the book is.
The Carrero story is absolutely fascinating. And, while I was reading your book, I kept thinking about Easter Island.
Yeah.
Was that very much on your mind as well?
What did you think? What were you thinking? What occurred to you?
Well, just this idea of how a society collapses,
Yeah.
And as there are so many instances in your book about societies collapsing.
Mm-hmm.
And so there are literally many instances of this happening. I mean, Easter Island is not the only one.
Mm-hmm. Has anyone been to Easter Island? How long is the flight to get there?
You have to go through Santiago. It's 5 hours from Santiago.
Yeah. It's like flying from LA to New York. And there's no land.
You have to get to Santiago first.
You've got to go to Chile. Yeah, it's in the southern hemisphere. But it is like the most remote inhabited island on Earth. And when the Polynesians would search for land, they would get their canoe together, right, with all this stuff they wanted. And they would always sail, when they were exploring, against the wind. Why would they do that? Right. So things went wrong, they could use the wind to get safely home. So that meant they were exploring at a very, very slow paces. And they used a search pattern, so they would go big sweeping patterns back and forth. It would be the slowest, widest route possible, but that's how you most safely and most likely found land. And so from Mangareva and the Marquesas, which are the original people of Rapa Nui, from where they started, we're talking about thousands of miles of open ocean. They say that if you had a chart with Rapa Nui on it, and you had a compass, if you missed it by half a degree, you would never see it, right? And if you miss it, it's another 2,500 miles to Chile. It's over. On that trip, and it was a one-way trip, it turned out, the pigs and the dogs died. The people who founded that island, and it's a formidable remote island, they only had chickens. Yeah, and their population did swell to, at one point, probably 20,000. It sustained 15,000 at some point. When Cook lands there in 1767, he says there wasn't a weed taller than your waist. There wasn't a single tree left. And he said that the men would swim to a little island to steal eggs. But they had sewn 2 planks together to make like a boogie board. We would call it a boogie board. But they didn't have a piece of wood 3 feet long on the island. That's what they braved the Pacific with. Eventually the population went down to 111 people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I loved all these details about navigation and so on. And of course, one always reads about how the Polynesians navigated with, by reading the waves, by reading the currents. And I've heard that those skills have more or less disappeared but are being revived. Is that the case?
Well, this is its whole fabulous topic. When I went to Tonga, like I had a guy. He was like my twin. Like the Tongans are like beautiful people, handsome people. They're big people. I've never felt normal sized in my life. My son is 6'9" and has size 18 feet. And one day he was just standing next to this kid at the event, and they exchanged shoes. Because that kid just happened to have size 18 feet too. But there was a guy, he was like my twin. His name was Noah, and my name is Adam. And he took me around to several islands. There were a lot of islands that you can't land at without permission, right? And, but he used his iPhone. He didn't use a compass. Like, why wouldn't he use his iPhone? Why wouldn't he? And I would ask people, like, when I would go to islands, I would say, oh, have you heard this story? Like in a book, in an obscure book, I'd heard this story about this island. And sometimes they had, sometimes they hadn't. Sometimes they were wary of this dude from California asking questions. So that was hard to parse. And once I felt maybe someone was ashamed of maybe not knowing an island story, they would say, I think that happened on that island. Or, oh no, that story's ours. She lived on our island. But one of the things about the navigation was that, like, the Rigel is a star, and the Tongans used it to sail. Tonga means south, right? So it's as far south as people went. And so, like, the Polynesians came south, the Tongan, there was nothing below it. And the Melanesians came this way, and they ran into the Tongans. And Viti of Fiji is Proto-Polynesian for sunrise, or east is the same word. So, like, those two people came and butted their heads there, where the south met the sunrise, Ooh, that's a good title. Damn, you can have it. I give it away. But, so, like, the Tongans would use Rigel, and they called that star Tu Samoa. And the Samoans called rising Nigel Tu Vanuatu. Right? So the stars didn't have a purpose. They weren't gods. They were just strictly utilitarian. Wow. And, like, one other quick example, like, there are birds that live on land and fly out over the sea, like noddies and bobbies and terns, right? And they all have a specific distance they'll fly from land. And so if you see a noddy, oh, there is land within 30 miles, because they never go farther than a certain sense of a distance. And so even if you can't see an island, it's time to start figuring it out. And so those birds all had specific names because they were useful. But the pelagic birds who, like, would roam the ocean and had no need of land, the albatross, the frigate bird, the tropic bird, the petrel, they all had the same name, Tavake. because it didn't help them to distinguish them. Does that make sense? So, like, even how they conceived of the world was whether it was of use to them to navigate.
Well, I'm meant to open this up for questions, so please get your questions ready. But before that, I've got to ask you one last question. Have
Yes.
you watched the Chief of War series?
I haven't. Jason Momoa is really hunky, and I think he wears a loincloth, and my wife is like, "It is time. It is." I don't know. I don't know. I haven't watched it yet because I'm totally interested in the topic.
It's very compelling,
Yeah.
I must say.
Is it violent?
Very violent, but so is your book.
Whoa, whoa, whoa! My book is a love story, my friends.
With these terrible gougings out and
There is like in my there in. I know it's question time, but there was a memoir of a young man who, in 1805, was his ship. When Cook landed there, he called it the Friendly Islands, because the Tongans, in their oral history, we know that they were cooking up a plot to murder everyone on his ship, right? And but there was a disagreement about how to kill him, and that infighting led to him escaping. And one of the ways they were going to kill him is they threw a big party for him. So he left, naming Tonga the Friendly Islands, to the peril of everyone who came after. And there was a ship that landed in 1805. The Tongans threw a party for them. They killed everyone on board except for one young man who reminded the king of his son. And so we have like a 600-page memoir of a young man who learned the language.
there's that character that figures in the Chief of War.
Is there really?
Yeah.
So I brought that up to say something, but I forgot. Sorry.
Anyway, now we're open for questions.
They all look
There's a
so
question right here.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm curious, obviously.
I think you got to use the microphone just for the recording.
Right, thank you, sorry. So, as you said, you're writing from or into this culture that is a great oral tradition. And obviously, writing or writing a novel, authorship is very modern Eastern European or European, the idea that you have there's the story and then there's the story as your uncle tells it, right? Those are two different things. How do you, and you mentioned how, going from the oral story to, a written was a strange translation. Could you talk a little bit more about that maybe?
Yeah, what a wonderful question. I do believe that narrative is a meaning-making machine, and that it works on all these levels of meaning, of linguistically, of memory, of emotion, of chronology, of causality, of structure. It has all these elements that add up to mean. And I do think when writers first deploy that machine, we do it on ourselves. It's autobiographical. Who am I? What does my life mean? You write stories, right? You write about your family. You write about your journey, your culture, right? And my first two books were very much like that. And then the book gives you the answers. And then there's a moment when you wake up and you realize, oh my God, I've got to go write about something else, which is fiction, not me. And then the serious questions began, at least for me. And I remember writing the Orphan Master Son, and when I would talk to defectors, which I could talk about North Korea all night, literally, I'm sorry. But I made this observation, first from reading the stories of them, online, very raw interviews, before I finally met my first defector, who had been an orphan in North Korea, and his story was very powerful. But his story came out of order, in fragments. And I realized it was a very painful story. And that what he was trying to do was share his narrative, achieve the catharsis of externalizing it. But when you tell a story, the meaning-making machine brings the pain back. And that's the dilemma of the hurt person. How do you tell the story without your story re-hurting you? When I suffer a setback and I tell a story, I weep. But like, what if your story's so serious it might incapacitate you? And what I noticed, just after talking to many people, was one thing. I was like, they told their stories in little pieces. And I don't know if you have a grandma who tells you a bit of a story about the old country every Christmas. And it's your job, or every holiday, sorry. And it's your job to put them all together. She isn't going to tell you the whole story. So stories that came in bits, that came out of order, stories that came in the third changing of point of view. I'll never forget a guy who talked about crossing the Yalu River, and he said, he was in the first person plural. He said, oh, we were scared. There were guards. We didn't know when to go. The river was strong. We were afraid. We got out of the water. There was a dad. He was by us. His daughter started to float away. I put her on my back. I was swimming, but then he lost her. He tried to get her. He tried to get her back. He couldn't find her. And when he got to the other side, she was gone. And I said, who was he? And he couldn't answer that question. And then I realized, because he didn't understand that he had done that. Does that make sense? And so I am trying to answer your question. When I tried to write about North Korea and why I did that, and is another question, or mystery, still a mystery, but I just knew it could never be like a beginning, middle, end Western sensibility. And the book had to fragment. The book had to change point of view. It had to leave it to the reader to put the story together. If I was going to be true to the people who had shared with me. It made the story less accessible. I know people have told me that. Like, why'd you mess it all up? And I get that. But it just felt true to me. And when I started reading oral histories, and listen to that, reading oral histories, right? I put a Post-it note on my monitor that said, forget the word novel. Like that's a word with a tradition, with conventions, with a history. And I was like, if I ever think of this thing, if I ever categorize it or name it, it will never have a chance to become the closest thing it could be to the material that's informing it.
Very interesting. There were other questions.
Yeah, I'm not sure if this has anything to do with Polynesian culture, but a long time ago, almost 30, 40 years ago, we were visiting Hawaii, just the two of us. And, I happened to pick up a brochure for going someplace, and it talked about a legend of a young boy who kind of flies off of a mountain and goes and grabs the sun and kind of swallows the sun. And it's a very similar story, as Mr. Ghosh might remember from Indian mythology, of a monkey god who actually does that. And I was just blown away, trying to think about how could that story be here in Hawaii. Mm-hmm. And so I just was wondering, did you actually run into anything where the mythologies, from different areas because of, migrations or whatever kind of came together? And, if Mr. Ghosh has a thought of that too, I'd be happy to hear that. But, just thought I'd ask and see if you ran into anything like that.
You have the anthropologist's mind, for sure. I ask questions like that all the time. Do you have a thought on that?
Well, certainly in India too, we have the two-gender god. Mm-hmm. It's one of Shiva's many incarnations, right. Avatars. But a lot of these folkloristic themes recur around the world, and it doesn't necessarily mean they're borrowed. Mm-hmm. It's just the human mind playing with possibilities, I would say.
In the American Southwest, the coyote steals the moon, and the lizard takes the sun, and I do think it's a very Proto-Polynesian story. This character of Maui is, even though different peoples formulate their different versionalities and iterations of Polynesian, which is a very oceanic culture, the idea of like Maui lassoing the sun seems to be very universal and is woven into different cosmogonies.
Well, it now seems to be the case that people are doing away with the land bridge across the Bering Straits theory of Native American migration. And increasingly, it seems they may have come by sea from Polynesia.
For sure. You know, when you think about like Polynesia, like there's, you know, the people made the 100-mile leap from mainland China to Taiwan. And like, you can't see Taiwan. And like, if you go as far enough from shore from China, you can't see Taiwan. You've got to make that risk of like, I can't see any land. I think that's the brave maneuver. And when you get there, you're like, oh, whoa, hello. And then, you know, the next island is like 150 miles. And then like 200 miles is Luzon in the Philippines, right? And so like people got trained to just make the leaps. And so the earliest Polynesians, because they were from this tradition of what we call China now, brought ceramics with them. And there's the Lapita tradition. So oddly, the earliest Polynesians took pottery with them everywhere, Lapita pottery. And from the patterns of those and the designs of those, like the earliest periods is actually the period we know the most about, as it spread through all of Polynesia and parts of Melanesia. But then at some point, everyone just abandoned it. It's a lot of work to fire pottery in a kiln, you know, when you can just eat off a banana leaf, honestly. And like everybody eventually gave this thing up. But, you know, people down through Papua New Guinea, like Jakarta, Indonesia, through all these places. They're also depending, in the Pleistocene, it was much easier to walk down from Thailand. So there are different ways of populating those areas. But, you know, the Polynesians went across the Indian Ocean too, and they went to Madagascar. Yeah. And so in Madagascar, the indigenous peoples there are not African. Like the 250-mile leap from Africa to Madagascar was just too much. Right? And so if you count to 10, if you're an indigenous person in Madagascar, that can be understood by someone in Tonga, because they're both Proto-Polynesian languages. There was no place they wouldn't go. And I think we don't know how many people died in that exploration.
Absolutely. And there were other questions.
You know, there's actually 2 love stories. I said it was a love story, but you can verify there are 2
there are many
love stories. Yeah,
yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
I'm wondering what your relationship is like with North Korea now and how that may have changed, and what you think your relationship will be with Polynesia over the next however many years.
Oh, no one has threatened to kill me from Tonga yet.
Good.
You know, just like to that, I do think, I'll speak for myself, the biggest misconception about like writers and novelists is that they set out to do things. And all of my friends who are writers have no idea what they're doing. They really don't. They're just curious, there are mysteries, there are unknowns. The research is fascinating. Some of your concerns and obsessions seem to map on to whatever you're learning. And the more you learn, the more you want to know. And I just became like a reader about North Korea. And I read one book about it, and I was like, I read another. But what I was looking for was like, most of the books were geopolitical and, you know, military and economic. I just want to know, like, how did you fall in love in North Korea? Like, what was it like to be a dad there? Like, what'd you have for breakfast? How do you get a job? I really just like, what was life like? And those narratives were inaccessible to me. I finally found them like online, but for like a year or two, I just kept going because the narrative was missing. I think that's where I understood like this thing that had been in me all my life of absence that I couldn't stand was manifesting itself. And now I can look back and realize, oh, I was researching for 2 years. And once I had poured all those human stories into me, they just started coming out. And if I was an opera writer, I would have written an aria or something, right? But I just started writing a book. And so I just kept, every day, and I still do, I ask, who was I to write a book about North Korea? I'm not Korean, I don't speak Korean. And worse though than just the cultural thing is like, I've never been tortured. I've never gone hungry. I tried an experiment to see how long I could go without eating. But you know what the problem was, right? I could eat anytime I want. The fridge was right there. What I couldn't replicate was not knowing where the next grain of rice would come from, you know? And I couldn't replicate like the oppression of an authoritarian regime. And the stories of the people that I encountered. And actually, I met more defectors after the book came out. Then I was like a guy who'd written a book about North Korea, and people were seeking me out. And I was like, where were you when I needed you? You know? But that's the truth of it. I did go to North Korea. You know, Kim Jong-il was a very predictable person. He wanted money and power, and he was very clear. And, you know, they have a whole hit list of people they want to kill, of defectors. So I don't feel like I'm in any danger there. But Kim Jong-un he's a different animal. And he does things that are against his own self-interest all the time. That doesn't make any sense to the outsiders. Closing the Gaesan industrial complex cost North Korea $1 million, right? $1 million a day. Closing the Raison free trade zone cost them. Like, what are they doing? Why is he doing it? He doesn't quite make sense yet. What was the question, Amitav? It was a good one. It was a really good question.
But I have a question. Have
Please.
you watched the wonderful Korean series about a rich woman who's paraglides into North Korea?
I'm in. Who has seen this show?
It's
Yeah?
wonderful.
Jemima, you recommend it?
Yeah, that's right.
Oh, that's right, Crash Landing
It's a
on You. I'm
wonderful
in.
show, really. Anyway, there were more questions. There was one back there.
So
Got
sorry, that
time
was a weak
for
answer.
one more question.
One more question, okay.
Oh my gosh. Hi, Mr. Johnson.
Hey, who is that? I can't see.
It's me, it's Anna.
Oh,
Hi,
hey,
nice
Anna
to see you.
Franklin.
Hi, nice
Yeah.
to see you. It's been 10 years, it's good to see you. I had a question about your writing process, humans versus animals. I wanted to see kind of if it was really different for you, or maybe you personified animals so much that it wasn't really that difficult for you to kind of write the two. And also, I know with certain cultures, they have different animals and that they're very prominent in certain cultures. Do you think that you felt obligated to bring in certain animals because you're like, these are the prominent ones, I need to talk about this? Or did you think, you know, these ones make sense to bring in as more animal representation? I don't know. I kind of wanted you to talk more about the animal side of it, if that's okay.
Totally. Anna's father is a wonderful writer I really admire and have known a long time. Yeah, what do we owe animals in our age? Like, I often, like, when you read old books, you're like, how is no one in this book talking about the slavery going on around them, right? How is no one, right? And I ask my students, like, in 100 years, what are people going to be horrified to read in our books? You know, will they just be shocked that people are talking about relationships as they drive their SUV to get Big Macs, right? But I do think animals are probably high up there. You know, when I was young, Jack London, I remember reading Call of the Wild, but were those animals? I mean, I don't know. I do remember reading Robert Stone's novel, A Flag for Sunrise. There's a moment when the two of the main characters are in a little boat at the end and something bad's gonna happen. And two sharks are circling. And Robert Stone like jumps out and has a dialogue between the two sharks. And it was like, I was like, oh, you can do that.
I wouldn't stop with animals, though. I mean, it's also trees and plants. Yeah. And your wonderful colleague, Richard Powers, has written so eloquently about that kind of voice. Yeah. But anyway, I suppose all good things must end, and we have to stop now, don't we?
I'll answer it in the signing line. It will be the most profound answer. It'll be just you and me in the signing line. Okay, thank you to everyone. Thank you to the Center for Fiction. Thank you, Melanie.